Hey, this is Paranormal Girl. The truth is out there. Scientists who investigated UFOs for 20 years for the government coined the phrase close encounters of the third kind and had a cameo in Steven Spielberg's hit film. He turned from skeptic to believer, inspiring a new TV show. In the late 1940s, reports of flying saucers flooded in from throughout the US, and in 1948 the Air Force was tasked with looking into the reports to calm the public down. They brought an accomplished astronomer, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who for nearly 20 years looked into the UFO reports and called for them to be scientifically studied. Hynek initially thought that sightings were a fad, but eventually changed his mind. He was the one that coined the phrase close encounters of the third kind and had a cameo role in Steven Spielberg's 1977 hit movie, and later said he had seen UFOs on 2 occasions. A new scripted TV show, Project Blue Book, takes a fictionalized look at his life. There's a picture there of Allen Hynek himself. "45 years before the catchphrase, 'The truth is out there,' was on the tip of many tongues, a man's search for the scientific explanations for the inexplicable lights and objects that streaked and whizzed and zoomed across the night sky. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was no Fox Mulder, but rather the real deal. An accomplished astronomer, the United States government tasked to help figure out what was happening in the skies after World War II. In the late 1940s, flying saucer reports flooded in from across the country, and the Air Force had no idea what to do with them. Hynek, a professor who was asked to consult for the Air Force's Project Sign, which was to investigate them. Initially, the man of science pegged the sightings as a fad, a manifestation of a country suffering from the after effects of the war and the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But as the unidentified flying object reports continued unabated, Hynek went from labeling them sheer nonsense to calling for the phenomenon to be scientifically studied to declaring that he saw UFOs twice. In the process, he satisfied neither side of the UFO debate. An encouraging father of 5 children, Hynek would become a celebrity of sorts, found the Center for UFO Studies. He wrote several books and coined the phrase close encounters of the third kind, complete with a cameo in Steven Spielberg's 1977 hit movie of the same name. He was this very straight-laced, by-the-book scientist and astronomer who only believed what he could see, said Mark O'Connor, author of his Close Encounters Man, How One Man Made the World Believe in UFOs. A new scripted TV series, Project Blue Book, on the History Channel, takes a fictionalized look at Hynek, his life, his investigations into UFOs during the early 50s, a time period gripped by the Cold War and nuclear war fears, and the question that we are still wrestling with today: are we alone in the universe? When Dr. J. Allen Hynek, pictured here, first heard about flying saucers in 1948, he said he thought that they were sheer nonsense, as any scientist would. That year, the US Air Force started Project Sign, which was to investigate the unidentified flying object reports that were coming in from around the country. According to Mark O'Connell's book, The Close Encounters Man, How One Man Made the World Believe in UFOs. Hynek is at a press conference here in this picture in 1966, where he said flying saucers look more like a chicken. Here's another very famous picture of the Roswell incident. And it reads, Disc craze continues. Army disc discounts New Mexico find as weather gear. Fort Worth, July 9th. An examination by the Army revealed last night that a mysterious object found on a lonely New Mexico ranch was a harmless, high-altitude weather balloon, not a grounded flying disc. Excitement was high in disc-conscious Texas until Brigadier General Roger M. Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force, with the headquarters here, cleared up the mystery. The bundle of tin foil, broken wood beams and rubber remnants of a balloon was sent here yesterday by Army Air Transport in the wake of reports that it was a flying disc. But the general said the objects were the crushed remains of a ray wind target used to determine the direction and velocity of winds at high altitude. And if you believe that, which I don't, my theory is, again, it was the government that was covering up an actual downed UFO craft. At first, Dr. J. Allen Hynek thought the sightings, which started to pour in during the late 1940s, were a fad. He thought they were a nervous public reaction to Pearl Harbor, coupled with what was then current worry about Soviet bombers attacking the United States. Mark O'Connell, author of The Close Encounters Man, told the DailyMail.com. But Hynek started to change his mind after the reports continued unabated. Above is this news clipping on the Roswell crash that I just mentioned. Here's another very famous picture of Hynek, of one of his investigations. Hynek, a professor, looked through and identified flying object reports for the US Air Force in 1948 and 1949, and then back to teaching and kind of forget about it. But around 2 years later, the Air Force approached him again to consult on the UFO investigative project. So he was very surprised after a couple of years that the craze hadn't faded away. Here is another shot of one of the sightings that was photographed at the time. And that was taken in 1966. It's very strange, whatever that is. Born on May the 1st, 1910 in Chicago, Hynek was just 5 days old when Halley's Comet passed by the Earth, a celestial moment that would be repeated towards the end of his life when he died at the age of 75 on April 27th, 1986. As a young boy, he battled a bout of scarlet fever, was restricted to bed for several weeks, and spent his time reading everything he could, including Elements of Astronomy, according to O'Connell's 2017 book. The die was cast, and a telescope was given to him at the age of 10. It sealed his pursuit of astronomy. In 1932, Hynek graduated with a master's degree from the University of Chicago and married his first wife, Martha Alexander. After getting his PhD in astrophysics, he started teaching at Ohio State University in Columbus 3 years later. Strange sky sightings seeped into the public consciousness during World War II, when pilots described seeing unusual lights and objects on missions, dubbing them Foo Fighters, in 1944. There were other stories and tales before then, of course. But the dam broke after a private pilot and businessman named Kenneth Arnold recounted that he saw 9 bright saucer-like objects race by at 1,200 miles per hour in June 1947, according to news reports at the time. For almost 20 years, Dr. J. Allen Hynek consulted the US Air Force's project to investigate UFO sightings. Afterwards, Hynek founded the Center for UFO Studies and wrote several books. In his 1972 book, The UFO Experience, A Scientific Inquiry, Hynek detailed what he termed close encounters. The first was a person seeing a UFO but from a distance. The second was UFOs' physical effects on the environment, such as crop circles. And the third was a person interacting with beings that appear with the UFOs. And here above is a picture of Hynek during a cameo of Steven Spielberg's smash hit Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which was released in late 1977. And if you've not seen the movie, I suggest you watch it. It is an absolutely fantastic film, and it is one of my favourites. Here's another very famous picture of the movie We Are Not Alone. Movie poster for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Hynek wrote director Steven Spielberg after he had heard the up-and-coming film and its title. Spielberg wrote the astronomer back, paid Hynek $1,000 to use his phrase, and hired him as a technical advisor for the film at $500 a day, according to Mark O'Connell. All summer long, reports kept coming in from every corner of the country. The trouble was that there was not a soul on earth who knew what to do with them. Confusion was the watchword for the flying saucer phenomenon in those early days. In 1948, the government set up Project Sign, which would later be called Grudge, and then Blue Book, to investigate the reports. It was headquartered at Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio, which was not far from Columbus, and O'Connell wrote that the Air Force needed a professional astronomer to validate its conclusions. Enter Hynek. By then, Hynek's first marriage to Martha Alexander had ended in 1939 in divorce. He married Mimi Curtis in 1942, and they would stay together until his death in 1986, and had 5 children together: Scott, Roxanne, Joel, Paul, and Ross. Here is another picture of Dr. Hynek, I believe on the set of Close Encounters himself. In his 1972 book, The UFO Experience, A Scientific Inquiry, Dr. J. Allen Hynek detailed what he termed close encounters, was the first person to see a UFO from the distance. I'm not going to read that because I'd actually already read this. Says his son, "Our dad is known in some circles, especially now, for his work with UFOs. But first and foremost, he was a scientist and an astronomer. One of the things that I think he had inculcated in us was the love of science and learning about the world. Paul Hynek, who worked as a consultant on the TV show with his brother Joel, told thedailymail.com, our dinner table, if it was not interrupted by phone calls from people reporting UFOs and whatnot, it was about ideas. Joel Hynek added, one of the things my father instilled in us all was his love of science and the idea that everyone should keep an open mind to whatever's out there. Initially, Hynek's buttressed the government's findings and conclusions. In 1948, when I first heard of flying saucers, I thought they were sheer nonsense, as any scientist would have," Hynek wrote. Most of the early reports were quite vague. I went into the bathroom for a drink of water and looked out of the window and saw a bright light in the sky. It was moving up and down and sideways. When I looked again, it was gone. Strange sky sightings seeped into the public consciousness during World War II, when pilots described seeing unusual lights and objects on missions, dubbing them Foo Fighters, around 1944. But it was Kenneth Arnold that recounted what he'd seen was 9 bright saucer-like objects race by at 1,200 miles an hour. And if you remember who Kenneth Arnold was, he was the one that brought back evidence of the crash of Roswell. And here is a picture here of the famous debris that they claim was a weather balloon. This is probably what the government planted. I don't believe that for 1 minute. This, in this picture, was a cover-up. Kenneth Arnold had actually kept the original piece and showed his family what he had found at that site. Here's another picture of Hynek coming out of an aircraft. After initially dismissing the UFO sightings as sheer nonsense, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, here in the picture, would change his mind about the reports. The first time Hynek consulted for the Air Force in 1948, they just plopped a pile of case reports on the desk in front of him and said, please go through all of these and tell us which ones are just misidentifications and astronomical objects. Hynek was able to explain away 80% of the reports, but not the other 20%. But he thought that that was enough time and resources they could probably explain away with those 20%. So in other words, there was 20% of the sightings that could not be explained away, and it was that 20% that he suddenly decided to look further into and realized something else was happening out there. After World War II, people saw things in the sky that they couldn't explain, said Dr. Allen Hynek, who investigated the sightings with the US Air Force for years, and was often a source of information for the public, and took part in press conferences such as the one that I showed in the picture above, 1966. In this photograph, he's holding a picture that was taken by Ann Abor from Michigan. Hynek said that the sighting was swamp gas, an explanation that did not satisfy many at the time. And you can clearly see here, this is not swamp gas. Of course, he had to say that because this is what Project Blue Book wanted him to say. He knew then that what he was seeing in these photographs was something else going on out there. And I think it was that moment it changed his mind forever about UFOs. Hynek thought that the sightings were a nervous public reaction to Pearl Harbor, coupled with what was then current worry about Soviet bombers attacking the US states. So of course they're looking up in the sky and seeing things and getting nervous about what they see. It might be that they may have seen UFOs, but it couldn't be explained back then. And here's another picture of Hynek with his family. And there's another picture with his children from his second marriage. There's another one there of him reading what looks like International UFO Reporter. There's a small picture here. So he would have talked to a group of people about his findings. He did actually change his mind on what he saw eventually when he saw 2 UFOs himself. After UFO sightings persisted, Dr. J. Allen Hynek started to call for phenomenon to be scientifically studied. One of the things his son said my father instilled in all of us was his love of science and the idea that everyone should keep an open mind. And here's another 2 UFO pictures that he had studied himself. There's a further one here. This is a very strange picture, actually. What is this? Is this a portal opening? Is this a UFO actually coming into our atmosphere? Is it a rocket even? Or is it some kind of technology that the government is using that we don't know about? And if you look here at these two UFO pictures, the classic disc shape and the dome, and you can clearly see that the sun is shining off of this. It's highly reflective. This is another one here. I mean, these are not government machines. These are something off-world. This one is the most interesting. The UFO investigator who witnessed two sightings. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, an astronomer who worked with the government for nearly 20 years, investigated sightings, saw UFOs on two occasions. He didn't see them very up close. They were brief, momentarily sightings. He saw one through the window of a passenger airplane. He was able to take a couple of photos of that, but honestly they looked just like a blob of light in a black field, which unfortunately is often the case with UFO photos. The other sighting was at his family's cottage in Ontario in Canada. But neither one of the sightings was a close encounter. He didn't get close enough to actually see any detail or outline and shape or anything. In a 1981 radio interview, Hynek said it was obviously an object. It was flying and has remained unidentified to this day. But I have never had a close encounter that is never anything really close by that I could say, oh my gosh, this is really something. I feel somewhat left out. In the TV show Project Blue Book, almost right off the bat, Hynek, who is played by Aidan Gillen of Game of Thrones fame, questions the government's conclusions, meteors, and a weather balloon for the unexplained things people see and experience. He was also given a partner, a fictional Captain Michael Quinn, played by Michael Malarkey. The show is set in the early 50s, a time when the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and the possibility of nuclear war loomed large. David O'Leary, the show's creator, said that the real Project Blue Book looked at over 12,000 UFO reports, and roughly 700 of those remained unexplained. Since childhood, he's had a fascination with the question of whether humans are alone in the universe. I personally don't think that you can look at that question honestly without examining the UFO phenomenon, O'Leary said, who convinced that the TV show was as real as a real-life X-Files set in the time of Mad Men. I also became fascinated with, America's very strange and mysterious history with the phenomenon, and of course one of the big pieces that is in fact what we really did openly investigate and identified flying objects in our skies officially through the US Air Force. The show is a piece of entertainment, but my goal always was to spark curiosity towards educating people about these real-life cases and about this era. In the show, it stars Hynek and Quinn crisscrossing the country from Fargo, North Dakota to the Flatwoods, West Virginia to Lubbock in Texas to investigate. Each episode is based on a real case or a collection of real incidents. In the series' second episode, the pair looks into the Flatwoods monster, where a mother and her two young children insist that they saw a spaceship and an alien creature. To quell panic in the town, Hynek puts the sighting down to an owl. It took the real Hynek longer to come around, O'Connell said, that after working for the Air Force in 1948 and 1949, he went back to teaching and kind of forgot about it. But around 2 years later, the Air Force approached Hynek to consult again. So, he was very surprised after a couple of years that the craze hadn't faded away. He started to look through the new batch of UFO reports. And surprise, there are still 20% that he can't explain. So for him, that 20% consistency, that was a trend. That was something that piqued his interest, and he wanted to find out more. And that was when he started to change his mind about UFOs. Hynek started to push for UFOs to be handled scientifically. For several years, he was saying nothing. There was nothing to it. I thought the whole thing was a fad, a craze, that would pass from the scene as fads inevitably do. Back in 1948, when I first started, I would have taken just about any bet that by 1952 the whole matter would be forgotten. It was the persistence of the phenomenon, not in the United States, but over the world, that would finally grab my attention, Hynek said. It appears indeed that flying saucers, along with the automobile, is here to stay. After the government shut down Project Blue Book in 1969, Hynek, who was then teaching in Northwestern University, launched the Center for UFO Studies. And in 1973, he started penning books. In his 1972 book, The UFO Experience, A Scientific Inquiry, Hynek detailed that he termed Close Encounters the first was a person to see a UFO but from a distance. The second was UFO's physical effect on the environment, such as crop circles. And the third was a person interacting with beings that appear with the UFOs. And if you remember the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, they actually saw the craft fly. It was Richard Dreyfuss that had the close encounter in his truck. And if you remember, it burnt the side of his face where he looked out of his windscreen to see the craft. He didn't know what it was at the time. But then, of course, there was the other story of the little child being taken. And so it's the mother of the child that come together with Rich Dreyfuss's character to search for the truth. And it's then that they actually see the Air Force Base where the craft is being in contact with the crew. It was the last gradation that inspired the director Steven Spielberg's smash hit Close Encounters of the Third Kind, released in 1977. By then, Hynek was a popular author who'd also had cachet within the scientific community. O'Connell pointed out in his book that Hynek wrote Spielberg after he had heard about the director's up-and-coming film and its title. Spielberg wrote the astronomer back, paid Hynek $1,000 to use his phrase, and hired him as a technical advisor for the film at $500 a day, according to his book. While on set, Hynek got to talking with Spielberg about making a Hitchcock-type cameo in the movie. Spielberg loved the idea so much so that the film, a whole sequence with Hynek interacting with the childlike aliens who have emerged from the mothership. Paul and Joel Hynek fondly recalled their father's brush with celebrity after the film came out. All of my friends thought it was extra cool to have a dad in a big Hollywood movie, Paul said. Paul Hynek noted that while his father did think that there was something to UFOs, he was not completely sold on the idea of extraterrestrials and had other theories about them. More likely something like interdimensional travel or something even perhaps more exotic. I think one of the biggest misconceptions of my father is that he went on a confirmed skeptic of the bunkum of flying saucers to a dedicated believer in the extraterrestrials having visited us, he said. Their father, Joel noted, was in an awkward position when it came to UFOs, and he tried several things to different groups. The Air Force wanted him to find an explanation for what people saw in the sky, while those who believed in UFOs and extraterrestrials wanted Hynek to come out and support their hypothesis. He walked a fine line there to keep the whole alive, if you will, Joel said. By 1981, the man who had dismissed UFOs as sheer nonsense said in a radio interview that he had seen them twice. I have seen on 2 occasions 2 things which satisfy the definition of UFO, Hynek said according to the book. It was obviously an object. It was flying and has remained unidentified to this day. But I have never had a close encounter. That is, never anything really close by that I could say. My gosh, this is really something. I feel somewhat left out. So my question to you, have you seen a UFO? And if you have, please leave a comment below. I'd be interested to hear your story.